So if you read the Washington Post, you probably know the byline of our featured author this evening, Eli Saslow. He's written some great enterprising feature pieces for the paper. He also has a pretty plum job these days, which is to live in Oregon with his family and travel the country, writing in-depth stories about the impact of major national issues on individual lives. How does one get such a dream reporting job? Well, by being one of the most talented feature writers of his generation. Just look at the list of Pulitzer Prize winners and finalists over the last few years, and you'll see Eli's name pop up quite a few times. Not only did he win the Pulitzer for Explanatory Reporting in 2014 for a series of stories about the rise of food stamps and hunger in the United States, he also was a finalist for the Pulitzer in Feature Writing in 2013, 16, and 17. And he has quite a list of other journalism honors to his name as well. Plus, he authored a moving book 7 years ago, 10 Letters, which delved into the stories behind 10 letters written and responded to by President Obama. Now, in his new book, Rising Out of Hatred, Eli recounts the remarkable transformation of Derek Black. Derek grew up schooled in racist ideology and was heir apparent to the white nationalist movement. But in college, Derek came to re-examine his racist beliefs and eventually repudiated them, denounced white nationalism, and publicly divorced himself from the movement. It was quite a shock when all this happened several years ago. Eli has crafted an extensive, intimate, and riveting narrative of the evolution of Derek's belief. He was helped a lot by the willingness of Derek and Derek's family and friends to cooperate, even allowing Eli access to personal emails, Facebook conversations, and message board chats. And while the book focuses on the journey of a single former white nationalist, parts of the story, as Eli says at the outset, reflect America's larger ongoing struggles with racism. Eli suggests that Derek's personal transformation could provide lessons for the nation's own way ahead. Indeed, one of the main takeaways of the book is the potential for dialogue and moral reasoning to overcome hateful dogmas. Now, the book's official release is actually tomorrow. So Eli is jumping the gun a bit here this evening, and we're really honored to be the forum for the global premiere of Rising Out of Hatred. Early reviews have been very complimentary. Publishers Weekly, for instance, commended Eli for showing, quote, an impressive even-handedness and empathy for everyone involved, and for providing, quote, a gripping and timely examination of the alt-right subculture. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Eli Saslow.
Thank you. Global premiere. I like that. Can you all hear me okay? Okay, great. If you can't, just let me know throughout. So, this is really the first time that I've started to stand up and start talking about this book that I've spent the last 18 or so months working on. And I can't think of any other place I'd rather do it. I know many of you. I've learned a lot of journalism from many of you who are here. This place is really special to me. I worked a lot on the last book that I wrote here in the coffee shop in the basement. I'm very grateful to all of you for coming, despite the rain, despite everything else. Really, really glad to be here and talking about it. It also feels a little bit unlikely to me because this is a story that I really did not expect that I would ever get to tell. It was very difficult to get the access necessary to initially write about Derek, much less to sort of have him opening up all of his private G chats and everybody else in his life doing the same. I first heard about Derek because I was thinking that I might write a story about Dylan Roof. This was now probably 2.5 years ago. Dylan Roof had just shot 10 people in a race a race-inspired murder in a church in Charleston, South Carolina. And he'd spent a lot of time on this website called Stormfront, which I'd heard about, but I didn't know very much about. So I wanted to start learning about this site. It's the largest, I think it started to diminish, but for 20 years, it was the largest racist website in the world, a huge international forum for neo-Nazis, Klansmen, also more sort of academically styled racists who spread propaganda about false racial science and things like that. A huge message board that has, its own dating sites, its own translation services, a massive community that brings in 500,000 people to talk about this kind of stuff every year. So I went on to this site to start trying to read what they were saying about Dylann Roof, who'd spent time on this website before committing these murders. And of course, they were saying horrifically upsetting celebratory things about what Dylann Roof had just done. But the biggest and most active thread still on this message board was about Derek Black, who at that point had disavowed this movement a full year ago. And people on this thread were speculating what had happened to Derek and where he had gone. And they were also speculating about what they might do to him if they found him. Derek was he was sort of raised at the epicenter of this Stormfront community. His father had started the message board. His father had also been the head of the KKK in the United States. Derek's godfather was David Duke, who sort of styled Derek as his protege. And Derek, in this very insular world, was taught these beliefs and sort of took it upon himself and was given the purpose for his life of mainstreaming them and spreading them further into sort of our political rhetoric, and did so in disastrously successful ways. I mean, by the time he'd turned 18, he had his own daily radio show in Florida on the airwaves where he was spreading this stuff. He'd been elected to office in Florida on a Republican committee, successfully already won office. And he'd started a white pride children's page that had gotten 1 million page views, had caused huge and tremendous amounts of damage. And so when I first reached out to Derek after he disappeared from this world, publicly disavowed it, he had changed his name and moved to a different part of the country, kind of hoping to disappear. And so when I saw this thread about him, immediately I thought, Dylann Roof, I do want to write about what happened there, but I was very interested in Derek and in also trying to find him myself. So he'd made himself a little bit difficult to find, but I knew what he'd studied in school. I was able to find him in his graduate program. I reached out to him, explained why I thought this story was really important, especially in the national moment. And Derek unequivocally said, no, this is a huge risk to my safety. Nobody knows where I am. I don't want anybody to find me. And I consider you contacting me like a risk to my privacy. I don't want to be public. So the story stayed on a list for me that I have of stories that I want to do. It stayed on that list for a year. And Derek and I stayed sort of sporadically in touch over email. And over the course of that next year, all of these things that had been so prevalent in his childhood and that he'd talked about on the radio, phrases like white genocide and the idea of sort of playing to this sense of grievance in parts of white America that mistakenly believe that they are victims of prejudice. Derek had helped mainstream this, had helped do a lot of it. Now he saw these seeds that he'd planted were growing all around him. And I think it terrified him. He understood the power of this rhetoric as well as anybody. He felt culpable. And he, at that point, told me that he felt like it was time that he needed to become more public and start saying things about it. So that's where this began. And building trust in these kind of reporting relationships is such a slow, sometimes long process. When I first went to go meet Derek in person for the first time, he told me to meet him in Ann Arbor, suggesting that was where he lived. I found out later he also had flown to Ann Arbor because he didn't want me to know where he lived. So we met in Ann Arbor. He spoke about everybody in his life with code names. His friends all had code names. He was really nervous about, what would potentially happen to him, what would happen to these other people on campus, and also knowing that his family was still at the top of this ideology that he was increasingly hoping to speak out against. So, it took trip after trip, and first writing a long piece in the Post, and then realizing that even with that, I'd only just sort of scratched the surface. I was able to tell some of Derek's transformation story, but not very much about kind of the people whose direct interactions with him brought about that transformation. And so the book is the story of those people as well. It's the story. Mostly it takes place at college, where Derek went to college when he was a little bit late in life at 21 as a transfer student. And that's kind of where this transformation begun. So I want to tell you about some of the people that he met at the college and what happened there. Derek was an incredibly smart, quirky, smart person, and almost like a savant for languages. So he speaks 4 languages. He by the time it was time to apply for college, the best school in Florida and also the cheapest school, public school in Florida, is called New College of Florida. It attracts a lot of homeschooled students. Pretty small school, 1,000 kids, and Derek, I think, felt like it was a good fit for him and decided to enroll. So I'm gonna read a little bit sort of about the culture clash when Derek first arrived at school. And when he arrived there, nobody had any idea who he was. Nobody on this campus had put together that the future heir to this white supremacist movement was living in their midst. This is from the book, but the book print is just too small for me. So I'm sure the book print will be perfect for you guys, though. It's going to be great. Like almost every other first-year student at New College, Derek devoured. Oh, I'm sorry. I should preface this by saying the culture of New College really revolves around this thing called the Student Forum. It's sort of like Stormfront. It's a message board and a email platform that students are trading messages on all the time. Students can send messages out to every other student at the school at once. Other students can respond and speak back to them. It's a very active sort of cultural exchange all the time at New College. Like almost every other first-year student at New College, Derek devoured the forum those first weeks, paying particular attention, as always, to language and vocabulary. For him, New College was an introduction to another new language, in which upper years tried to educate new students on social issues. Here was a place that often strived for the ideals of universal equality and human respect. Students used the forum to plan a conference on civil disobedience and a protest in support of immigrant tomato pickers. They wrote that race was a social construct, but that white privilege was structured into every part of American society. On the forum, identity was fluid, the right to self-expression was paramount, and a straight man was, in fact, a person whose chosen gender identity happened to match the sex he was assigned at birth, or, for short, a cis-hetero male, a position of inherent privilege in the American patriarchy. At New College, political correctness could occasionally become a contest of one-upsmanship, and there was social cachet to be won by pointing out prejudice in its smallest manifestations. One student admitted that he liked to wear glasses, despite having 20/20 vision, and then another student said that was ableist, because he was appropriating the legitimate struggle of disabled people. Maybe so, countered another student, but in fact there was no such thing as disabled people, and that phrase was a microaggression against people with disabilities. And then there was Derek, the ascendant white nationalist leader living anonymously in his dorm room, helping to moderate the world's largest white pride website and calling into his own political radio show 5 mornings each week. On the air, he repeatedly theorized about the criminal nature of blacks and Hispanics and said Jews worm their way into power over our society. He said President Obama was anti-white culture, a radical black activist, and inherently un-American. There was nothing micro about Derek's aggressions. He knew that if his views were discovered at New College, he would be vilified on the forum and ostracized on campus. So he decided that semester to be a white supremacist on the radio and an anonymous college student in Sarasota. In the mornings while his classmates slept, he walked alone to a patch of grass outside the dorm and called into his radio show to join his father on the air, and together they railed against the minority takeover. Whenever his classmates asked, Derek explained his morning ritual as a daily catch-up call with an unusually close family. Then he hung up the phone, returned to the center of campus, and befriended whoever walked by. Derek remained anonymous on the New College campus for almost a full year. And he went abroad to Germany and actually was spending time staying over there with David Duke when one student at New College was doing some research on the growth of extremist groups in the United States, went to the SPLC, Southern Poverty Law Center website, and began looking at photos of some of the big extremists in America and recognized in those photos the picture of a classmate that he had seen on campus. So he posted Derek's identity on the forum, and the school sort of exploded into activity. It very quickly became a post on the forum that had thousands of comments, students sort of talking to each other about what they should do about this. And Derek, meanwhile, on the other side, was sort of using this as saying he felt threatened by these other students, and that what he wanted to do in response to this was he wanted to come back to campus and sort of prove that he was right in his ideology by bringing academic racists to campus to talk about white nationalism and these sort of things. And I think, honestly, that's where this story would have ended in terms of Derek's ideology never would have changed. He never would have shifted about anything unless there was really sustained and courageous activism from students on campus who used really different approaches that I think in some ways are instructive to begin to influence Derek's thinking. And I think the one consistent thing in all of these cases is that it took a lot of time. From this moment where Derek was exposed on campus to when he disavowed this ideology, that was almost 2 years. And what students on the campus did was they invested themselves in trying to impact the way Derek thought about things and trying to impact his behavior. And they did that in a variety of ways. I'm going to introduce you to a few of those people and also give you a sense of sort of the ways in which they did them. I think sometimes now in the country, there's a way in which we talk about civil resistance or civil discourse in terms of solving our social problems as if it's a binary choice. Like we either need to block out hate speech and shame it and shun it and keep it as far away from us as possible, or we need to build relationships and communicate with people and try to bridge these divides. I think the lesson in many ways from Derek's story is that in his case, both of those things were not only essential, but they also were complementary. They worked together. So this is one student's immediate reaction. Amidst the initial chorus on the student forum, one voice began to rise above the rest, equal parts indignant and insistent. James Birmingham, 26, had already graduated from New College with a degree in anthropology, but he remained an active forum user and a staunch advocate for students of color. He was half Chinese, and in 6 years as a campus organizer, he'd helped coordinate marches for indentured farm workers and an annual conference where radical leftists from around the world exchanged ideas for breaking down the systems of oppression. One of those oppressive systems was white supremacy, which James had devoted himself to fighting ever since he was a 16-year-old heavy metal fan, and skinheads in the mosh pit began calling him a chink. Each fall at New College, James witnessed the very real effects of centuries of racist policies and white privilege. He led orientation groups for first-year students, and one group exercise in the orientation manual began with students lined up side by side at the bottom of a wide stairway. Take one step up the stairs if you're white, James would tell them. Take one step if you're male. One step if you're straight. If your parents went to college. If you own a car. If English is your first language. If your high school taught the culture and history of your ancestors. And year after year, James watched the most privileged group of students, the ones who looked exactly like Derek, fly right up the stairs, just as they typically ascended to the top positions in American society. Whites were much better off than any other social group by every statistical measure. Income, net worth, life expectancy, home ownership, infant mortality, graduation rates, and on it went. And now, as another school year was about to begin, James kept reading on the forum about Derek, who believed he was oppressed and victimized by a lifetime of anti-white discrimination. The ignorance and hypocrisy was too much for James to bear. One night that fall, James posted again on the forum to offer his advice. Ignore Derek. Heckle him. Make him feel uncomfortable. Protest his presence at every opportunity. Some of you may be correct that ostracizing Derek won't change his mind, James wrote. But at least if he disappears, I can go about my daily business without having as much of an urge to throw up. This sort of campaign of ostracism was really effective. Derek was sort of cast out from parts of campus. Initially, he lived off campus, far away from the school, and he really spent most of his time away from the rest of the community. And I think, one of the things that this accomplished is that Derek for one of the first times, saw reflected back at him how horrible all these people at this college thought his beliefs were and how unacceptable they were. And also the fact that Derek was totally isolated left him in a position that when some students did begin to reach out to him, it had a profound effect, because Derek had no other relationships, nobody else talking to him. And it really sort of multiplied the effects, I think, of some of this outreach. So I'm going to talk quickly about two other students who began reaching out to him. One of them is a woman named Allison, who initially actually also thought that she did not want to be anywhere near Derek, wanted to protest his presence. When her friends would invite him over, she would stay in her room. She wouldn't come out. She didn't want to deal with him. Over the months, she started spending enough time around him to begin feeling like Derek wasn't dangerous. He wasn't saying threatening things to her. And in fact, he was thinking thoughtfully about some of the people around him, and he'd managed to spend some time on campus on a campus that really was pretty predominantly white. Derek's few friends that he did have were people of color, and she started to sort of get very curious about him, like what something did not seem to fit for her. So what Allison did is she really armored herself with research and decided that she was going to debate. She signed up for a class at New College called Stigma and Prejudice, where the syllabus was basically filled with studies of racial science, like flawed ideas that white nationalists spread about IQ differentials between races, things that are super debunked. And Allison first built a relationship with Derek, and then began arguing with him over this stuff again and again and again. And in order to sort of understand his views better so that she could argue against them, she took the fairly drastic step of going undercover with him to a white nationalist conference in the woods of Tennessee, so she could sit in the audience and hear all of the things that people were saying, writing them down in a notebook so she could begin fighting back against Derek. Allison has a huge role in this book, because her relationship with Derek, largely through these arguments, deepens into eventually a romantic relationship. And that the intensity of those arguments fuels that and blows that up again and again in ways throughout the book. I guess the one other example of what some students did that I would like to point to or acknowledge is that a few other students on campus, particularly two Jewish students, decided what they were going to do to try to impact Derek's thinking is they were going to not build a case against him, which is what Allison was doing, but they were going to build a relationship with him. Just hoping in the pure fact that maybe sort of exposing Derek to more people not like himself, in that alone would be transformative. And that maybe if Derek actually started spending time with some Jewish people on campus, he might realize that some of his ideas about Judaism had been wrong. So two students, Matthew and Moshe, decided when Derek had been ostracized from the campus to start inviting him over for Shabbat dinners at their dorm room. And Derek, I think because he didn't have anything else to do, he knew Matthew in particular from a class they shared together freshman year, said that he would come. And Derek, over the next 2 years, came to these Shabbat dinners every Friday night, basically. This was sort of the social epicenter of his life on campus. And Matthew and Moshe, in part because they wanted Derek to keep coming, they never talked to him about white nationalism. They had read every post that Derek had written on Stormfront saying terrible things about Jews, and they just continued to invite him over and talk to him about other stuff, hoping that, the relationship in itself would have an impact. Again, like thinking about how long these kind of transformations, significant transformation in anybody's life, I think takes, that required a stick-to-itiveness that I still have a little trouble understanding. And so I'm going to read a passage of the book about that. So this passage comes, at this point, Derek has been coming to dinners at the Shabbat table for a year. And Matthew and Moshe have just found out that he's gone to this white nationalist conference to be a big keynote speaker, and that Allison, who they also know, has gone with him undercover to learn about it. So Moshe's grandfather was essentially he's a Hungarian Jew. His whole family, most of them were wiped out in the Holocaust. His grandfather was sent to Bergen-Belsen, a concentration camp, when he was a year and a half old. Survived the concentration camp, one of few, and then had health problems that plagued him the rest of his life. And this family history really informed a lot of Moshe's childhood. Much of Moshe's childhood had been shaped by his grandfather's experience. He studied the Holocaust, taught himself German in high school, and read Hitler's autobiography. When Moshe was 17, he traveled with his brother to the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, stopping at Anne Frank's gravestone and then walking down the camp road into the memorial, where he could see the sandstone foundation of the old barracks and the burial mounds pushing up against the dirt, each one adorned with a sign that said, 1,000 buried here. He looked at the camp's alphabetized roster of prisoners, flipping through until he saw his grandfather's name, and only then did he see the list of names that followed. There were more than 50 people on the roster with his last name, Gross, some listed as victims and others as survivors, an extended family tree that went on page after page. Moshe had returned home after that trip and watched documentaries about modern-day anti-Semitism, learning about Stormfront, Don Black, and David Duke. Moshe read Duke's autobiography, which contained passages about Duke's own visits to concentration camps, which Duke considered to be mostly a hoax. Duke said gas chambers in the camp were designed only to disinfect clothing. He said Holocaust survivors were evidence that the Holocaust hadn't really been that bad. He said Hitler was a great leader, and Nazi Germany was in many ways the ideal country, an example worth following. And then Moshe brought all of that knowledge with him to New College, where Duke's godson and protege happened to be in his first banking class. And instead of confronting Derek or dropping the class, Moshe had somehow found it in himself to befriend Derek, to invite him over for beers, to join him at Shabbat dinners, and sometimes speak with him in the German they'd both decided to learn because of their divergent family legacies. A full year now. That was how long they'd been sitting around the table on Friday nights. That was how long Moshe had been buying Derek's salmon, pouring his kosher wine, hoping for some kind of transformation, believing again and again in the essential goodness of humanity. Moshe wondered, what if all he'd done by befriending Derek was to enable him, to provide him with cover from the activists on campus so he could continue to promote a racist ideology while living a comfortable college life? What incentive did Derek have to change? He had a standing invitation for Friday nights. He had a group of friends who would sit with him in the cafeteria. And now he had a new friend, Allison, who was willing to go with him from their liberal college to a white nationalist conference in Tennessee. Maybe she was going to become a white nationalist too, Moshe thought. Maybe, all this time, it was actually Derek who had been doing the persuading. Won't let that cliffhanger hang very long. Derek was not doing the persuading. It took another 6 months after this of intense debates and conversations. And also Derek, because Derek had worked really hard to try to base his ideology on facts, very flawed facts, but the fact that he then realized he was wrong about all of these facts, he had a total misconception of just, race in general. He had a total misconception of world history and this idea that white Europeans had been dominant. And then he actually began to find out that during the medieval time that he studied, the Islamic world was far ahead of the European world. And so all of these things began to sort of thaw away some of his ideas. Even once he basically no longer agreed with white nationalism, it took him still another few months to have the courage to first decide that he needed to do something about it, and then to make a very public post on the Southern Poverty Law Center website, disavowing his family, disavowing everything he'd learned, and sort of also in that initial post unraveling why he believed white nationalism was flawed and dangerous. I think by the time that I first reached out to Derek, his evolution had reached another point where he had seen around him the full power of this stuff rendered. I mean, I think I learned a lot from Derek about just some of the ways in which white nationalists have further pushed a lot of this really divisive rhetoric into the mainstream. And Derek was a big part of it. Instead of sort of talking about race explicitly, Derek initially had the idea of banning all slurs from Stormfront, which they did, no more racial slurs, and beginning to sort of play to this idea of false white grievance in the country. I mean, right now, in the US, polls consistently show that 40 to 50% of white people believe that they experience more prejudice than people of color. And Derek and a lot of other white nationalists had realized that by playing to that sense of grievance, they could really build their audience. And by talking about things like this country inherently belongs to you, it's changing, it's being taken away from you, that could really empower their movement, which it has. And the reason that that's so dangerous is because much of it, unfortunately, is true. And I think Derek's ultimate realization is that the white supremacy and that's so embedded in the founding of this country, unless he stares into it and others stare into it and confront it, this stuff continues to spread and grow. And I think that's what Derek has committed himself to trying to make people more aware of. And I think is devoting himself more to that life now in an effort basically to counteract as much as possible the damage that he's done. So thanks for listening to me talk about some of those people. I really appreciate it. And I would love any questions. Thank you. Yes, please.
Mr. Saslow, thank you so much for being here today. I'm a college student here in the Washington, D.C. area, and I started reading your book today and really am finding it to be very meaningful. In particular, I found learning about the Shabbat dinners that Matthew invited Derek to be truly interesting and meaningful. It was particularly meaningful to read at this time of year around the time of the Jewish high holidays. I'm seriously considering, after completing my studies, working in a profession in which it will be possible to make meaningful contributions to human rights. That's one career option that I'm considering. My question is, what advice would you have for me and other young people like me considering that path?
Thanks for asking. I really appreciate the question, and thanks for starting to read the book. I think the one consistent lesson that I feel like I learned by reporting in depth on a lot of the people in the book is that they chose to invest themselves and put a huge amount of time into deciding they cared about forging some kind of change and sticking with that. I think especially now when our country is so polarized and people's ideas about things can seem so intractable. Just the idea that anybody can change their mind about anything is sometimes difficult. And I think if you can figure out the way to the way that you can make the most difference and really devote yourself to it, whether, like for James Birmingham, that was by organizing civil resistance on campus. For other people, that was by, for Matthew and Moshe, it was by inviting somebody over again and again. I think there are a lot of different approaches that can work. I think the thing is to know that real change takes a lot of time and to be patient if it's not coming quickly. Thanks for asking.
So this is all really interesting and encouraging in a sort of a way. Where did he come from? Where did he grow up? What was the community in which he was? And why on earth did he go to the new school instead of the Reverend Falwell's whatever? Right. Liberty College.
Yeah.
Liberty University.
Right. Great question, and one I asked Derek many times myself. I mean, so he grew up in Florida, and he grew up in Palm Beach, Florida, which is actually a really diverse place. But Derek's childhood essentially existed in this cocoon of white nationalism. He was homeschooled. His parents pulled him out of school in second grade because they thought the schools had diversified and no longer were teaching him, the white pride history that they wanted him taught. So he spent most of his time at home. His family's house in West Palm Beach, where a lot of this hate movement is still run out of. Right. It's in downtown West Palm Beach, but it's sort of set back from the street. They've let the mango trees grow really unruly around the house. It's sort of hidden back. And Derek spent a lot of time with his father traveling around the South to white nationalist conferences, rallies, things like that. So that's how he spent a lot of those formative years. I think he went to New College in large part because it was a really good school. It was cheap. And nobody, including Derek, and certainly nobody in the white nationalist movement, thought that any kind of change for him would ever be possible. He was one of the most outspoken. He was the most outspoken young white nationalist in the country. He had publicly devoted himself to a life of this. And before he went to school, Don Black said something on the radio that's in the book that was like, if anybody thinks any of these little commies are going to impact Derek, if anybody's convinced, there will be the other kids. So I think it was just never in his idea that a change was possible. Never in his mind. Thank you for asking.
Your book is titled Rising Out of Hatred. Yep. Your article in the Washington Post, from which this was originally adapted, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago?
Yeah.
I read it. I haven't started reading the book yet because it comes out tomorrow.
Right, exactly.
So forgive me.
Why haven't you read it yet?
Yeah, how did that guy get a copy? It comes out tomorrow. Your article was not titled Rising Out of Hatred. It was called The White Flight of Derek Black.
Yeah.
A title I loved because I love the irony between white and, the words white and black. I thought that was a clever use of language. Why the title change?
Good question. I think so for me, part of it was the more I thought about The White Flight of Derek Black, sort of the less it made sense to me. Like it's very rhythmic. It sounds nice. I also like the play in between, but it just, the white flight of Derek, I had trouble explaining it to people. And also, so that was a problem. I think the idea of rising out of hatred, part of just the moment that we find ourselves in where, I think different kinds of hate and hate speech is so prevalent in our political rhetoric and, was really like the ecosystem that Derek came out of. It felt more true to what the book was about.
Thank you.
So thanks for asking. I can do an alternative title on top of it for you if you want.
For the paperback, maybe.
For the paperback, it's a deal.
Boy, what a fascinating story! I did catch at least parts of the earlier Post.
Oh, good.
Article, and so my question really is, I guess, just to kind of clear up a few things. I'm still a little. At what point in time did Derek sort of stop going on the radio? At what time during his college career did he stop going on the radio and joining his father and so forth?
Right. Great question.
I guess it's not a related, but I do have a follow-up. So if I don't have any followers in the line, I'll ask it.
He sort of tried to quietly withdraw from the radio show at first by explaining to his father that he was busy with schoolwork, busy with academic work, and started to show up less and less frequently. I would say in his senior year of college. By the end of college, he'd officially withdrawn from the radio show just by telling his father that he wasn't he wasn't interested in it anymore. But even when Derek graduated from New College, and I know there are a few New College people today who are here who were influential for Derek. But when he graduated, he had not said anything against white nationalism. He walked across the graduation stage, and many students thought we've had no impact on him whatsoever. It wasn't until about 6 months after he graduated that he publicly disavowed everything.
The other question is about the romance. I find that really intriguing. Not that it would happen, but it just strikes me as a possibility that was a huge influence on him. Because,
for sure.
Because assuming that this was a serious romance, and it almost had to be in order to, that alone, because of its sort of a parallel emotional track to his heart and his thinking.
Yes.
It
was a huge...
Did she change in any way? It's sort of related perhaps because of the romance relationship, or
right. I think so. Allison and Derek, for most of college, Allison refused, even if she felt attracted to Derek in ways like she refused to have a relationship with him, mostly because. Well, I think the reasons are obvious. So she instead was just, but their relationship was getting more and more intense because every day they were on GChat and all of these other channels having super long debates about all of this stuff. And Derek was beginning to trust her and sort of confide in her more about his own ideas and his own background than he had with anybody else. So, and much of the book, much of his transformation is sort of in those conversations with Allison that are in the book. But I think that, Allison is now she's a PhD psych candidate, and she's very, she often explained that there's a stage of like late adolescence where identity is a little bit more fluid, and Derek like had moved away from his family, was forming all these other intense relationships. It was a natural time in his life for him to begin challenging some ideas, and so I think the romance and their arguments over this stuff sort of went hand in hand. Like the fact that she was really the one person first on campus who chose to directly fight with him about these ideas fueled like a closeness and an intensity in that relationship. Thanks for asking. Oh yeah, sorry about that. I didn't know there was another one.
Yeah.
Sorry.
So I guess it's a really interesting story. I guess how much is it really particular to both the person and, as you just stated, the time in his life in terms of being able to use similar approaches to engage and really have dialogues with other people, and in particular thinking college students have a lot of time and sort of that intimacy with the people that they're around them to have those discussions. If you look at someone who most people just don't have that time in the day.
Sure.
And are busy as working and taking care of families. So do you see this as something that is expandable, or just given your last comment, it's like maybe it is important to target people at that age and look for community things, whether it's community core or something else, where people can have more shared experiences when they're at that transition point.
Right. Yeah. I think one of the things that I think goes along with this a little bit is that most of us, fortunately, are going to be lucky enough that we're not put in a position where we're confronting or trying to change the like ascendant heir to the white nationalist movement. So he had so far to go. Also, it's like he went from way on this end of the spectrum to now being really far on this end of the spectrum. And so I think it took that kind of investment for somebody to move that far. I think in dealing with like people who have problematic racial ideas or, more subtle racism that really is like the bigger breathing problem in our country all the time. I think, we're not trying to move people quite as far most of the time. So I also hope the investment is a little bit less and make some of it more doable. Thanks for asking.
So 2 questions. The first is, so what is his relationship now with his family and former friends or community, and what kind of reaction did his former community have to him? Is he branded as a traitor? Is he misguided? So that's one thing. And the other is there seems to be a strong parallel between his experience and what happened to the former head of the Ku Klux Klan in Maryland when he was befriended by a black man. I don't know his name or the story. You're familiar with what I'm talking
Vaguely,
about?
Yeah.
It seems like the same kind of radical friendship or radical empathy over a period of time.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that may well be true. I mean, so I think at large in like the white supremacist movement on say Stormfront, where now there's a creepy thread about the book. Derek is branded as a traitor and as somebody who has betrayed, had all of the sort of the some of the secrets of this movement, and also some of was on his way to rising into power in it, and they feel like him leaving it cost them heavily, and he's thought of as a traitor. What's much more complicated for Derek is his own family, because his father is still at the forefront of this stuff, still runs Stormfront. His mother is equally ideologically committed in a very strange drama in the insular white nationalist world. Derek's mother was married to David Duke before she married Don Black. This is all of these people, David Duke, his mother, his father. These are this is his family. And so and his father, who's a major presence and character in the book, experienced Derek's transformation like a death. It broke him in many ways. And so they have not found their way really back into conversation, but they also, it's still Derek's dad. And, it really complicates a lot of this stuff for him, because he also knows that the more prominent he becomes pushing back against this stuff, every time his father is, rightfully so, the villain in the story. So yeah, thanks for asking. Yes.
I have not read your book either, but certainly thank you, for your work. I'd like to know who is here from New College, because I have some questions about.
Do New Collegers want to acknowledge? Yes. Blair? Anybody else? Thank you for coming. Oh, yeah. Kotu? Awesome. Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming, guys.
Well, thank you all for your work. I want to thank you, too, because I think this is partly where the answer is that it takes people like you to do something about racism in this country, because racism is the central narrative of this country, has been from its beginning, still is, and some of us believe may always be. But having said that, I rise to comment, and Brett looks for me to do so because I am the only person of color who came to say something. And I am a descendant of people who were enslaved in Virginia on both maternal and paternal side. So, my coming at this and looking at this is quite different than anybody else, who is here, unless they have had the experience of my ancestors and my people. And even so, some people can still identify as white, but it's when you have a brown skin or a black face, or even yellow for that matter, this is when the dynamics change. And I hope eventually, you will get to look at that as well. Were there any students of color at New College?
Yes, and students of color who were impactful in changing Derek's thinking. And I would also say that, parts of the book where these debates are happening and Derek is reconsidering all this stuff, part of it is him beginning to understand the ways in which race is a social construct, and him going back through history and looking at the fact that really whiteness as a term in the United States or in the English language didn't exist until landowners were trying to differentiate themselves from slaves. Mm-hmm. And I think
that is the history.
Yeah, part of I think the reassuring thing, I guess, in part of this is that the facts are on the side of the anti-racist. The facts are a main part of what brought Derek into his realization.
But that's an intellectual, and an understanding, and that everybody is not going to have for whatever reason, and to some extent it sort of reminds me of the song Amazing Grace. The man who penned it had been a ship captain for 37 years.
Right.
And all of a sudden, he transforms. I mean, the music came from really the moaning and groans of the slaves and stuff below him that died and suffered, but in terms of those years of experience. And I have a lot of ambivalence when I hear that song, and I hear it often because it is lifted up as such an amazing experience that by grace, this man was saved and then was able to go on and to do some anti-slavery work. But nevertheless, it's my people that were enslaved and brutalized and hung and houses burned and you name it, it was done, and raped and breeded, all for profit, you see. Right. And, you go to the southern plantations and down south, or you read American history as it should be, or read some of the original secession documents out of South Carolina and out of Virginia. They make it very clear why they formed a confederacy, okay? And, but, be that as it may, I just wanted you to understand, where I'm coming from. But I applaud you for your work, and thank you for doing it, and for all of those at New College who helped in this endeavor, and I hope it will be your life's work.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the comment. Mm-hmm. Thank you. Absolutely.
Just a window on the past, maybe a little one. 40 years ago almost, I was in Army counterintelligence in Berlin, U.S. Army Berlin, and we got a letter from the FBI. And this was in the days when the KKK was on the list of 40 some, as I recall, subversive organizations in the United States. So the FBI said, you guys might want to put this guy, this soldier, in the Berlin Brigade out of the Army because he was a KKK member and so forth. So I talked to him, and he was a really good kid. He had been a writer for the KKK, published a newsletter, met the guy who murdered the guy under the bridge in North Carolina, all that kind of stuff. And he was totally even. He joined the KKK just because he wanted to find out about it. And he did, and he wasn't attracted to it at all. He stayed like a year or two, as I recall, and left. And so we wrote all this up. And, of course, we went to the commander of the Army Berlin Brigade, Usserer, down in my boss down in Munich, back in the States here, Army headquarters. Never heard a word. Everybody took our word for it. He stayed in the brigade. Never got a question on it. It just, everybody was honest.
Right.
And that was the way it was.
Yeah. Thank you for the story. Thank you.
Yes. Hi. It's clear why Derek has to be concerned about his safety, but I wonder, you in writing this book, have you taken on a risk?
Oh, no. I hope not. I think, but it's certainly something that I've thought about. It's also, with the kind of work that I do a lot of the time, where I'm going out and spending time in intense places and sometimes in intense times in people's lives. I think reporting often brings with it a small risk. But in this case, I think the much greater risk that I worry about is to a lot of the people who are in the story. I'm the book. I'm not very present in the book. I'm never really present in my own journalism. Like it's the book unfolds in scene and dialogue because I had this incredible reporting gift of the fact that most of the characters in the book are millennials. They document their lives relentlessly. And I had like GChats, Instagram, Facebook. I had like the real-time documents. And also Derek and his father were on the radio show for 2 hours every day. Yeah. And I had all of those records too, in addition to forum. And so, the book is all of them engaging in these ideas and not me engaging in these ideas, which I think first of all, and most importantly, makes it a more true and more powerful book. It's just a narrative story that you're reading, but also it means that, I think if readers take issue with things or if they're upset about things, it's going to be with the people who were actually doing the work in the story. Not that I'm ducking behind them for cover, but thank you very much. Oh, yeah. I mean, and I spent, I particularly Don Black. I mean, I made 3 or 4 trips to Florida where I was, having a series of long days interviewing Don Black, on taped recordings for the book. And I think, the fact that Don participated made it so that some of these other people participated and gave me, opened up and allowing me to spend time with them. And I think, honestly, the reason that Don did it is it was like it facilitated a conversation with Derek that he wasn't otherwise having. He didn't really know what had happened to Derek. He doesn't really talk to Derek. And so spending a ton of time talking with me about Derek was sort of a way to connect back into that relationship that he didn't otherwise have. And the other thing is there's, Don Black and these other like white supremacist characters in the book they have done irredeemable things in their lives, and they don't ask for any redemption. Don Black is still a white nationalist. He still believes all of the things he always believed. So instead of me having to write a polemic that is me judging him, the acts, the things that he's done, I think they make it clear to every reader, where he's at. And in fact, when Derek leaves this movement, one of the things, there's a moment where it almost seems like Don is so broken by this that maybe there's a chance that he might begin to see things differently too. And instead, he cultivates a mentorship relationship with Richard Spencer, who sort of rises into the place that Derek potentially was going to be.
So,
Great.
Eli, I was going to just quickly ask you, focus rightly on the story. I was going to ask, this is your second book. So what were the biggest challenges for you, other than having 3 young kids, in actually finding the time and too much information, it sounds like, from the source materials? What were the biggest challenges for you in writing the book?
Sure. It's a great question. Thanks. I think the biggest challenge is that although, there's so much darkness in these places, and just in the racist history and policy and beliefs that this story sort of reconciles with. And so, sometimes going on runs and having to listen again to Don and Derek on the radio talk about unpleasant stuff that wasn't a fun space to sit in. I think the fact that the story travels to a place where Derek comes out of it makes it much more possible to look into that and to deal with it. But that was, I would say, sometimes the hardest stuff, is thinking about these ideas that are not the problems with race in our country are not new, and they're not going to be easily fixed. And so sort of reconciling with the full weight of that a lot of the time was also difficult, despite my own privileges. Thank you.
She kind of stole my question. I was wondering, are you going to write about Dylan Roof? What are you working on now, and why Oregon?
Yeah, no, I don't think I'll write about Dylan Roof. I think I've spent enough time in this space. My journalism for the Post, I've written for the Washington Post for 13 years or so. I try to write about the big issues in the country as they're impacting people's lives. So the last story that I wrote was about land that is beginning to be seized on the Texas border to build a wall, to build Trump's wall, and the families who came to that land on Spanish land grants in the 1700s and now are having to decide whether or not to fight the government or have that land, their last land, taken from them. So right now I'm sort of back to my work, going and spending a lot of time in people's lives and writing about what they're dealing with. Thanks for asking. I'm sure I will, these problems, unfortunately, right now in our moment, touch on so many things that I'm sure I will write about them again. Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to you all for coming. Appreciate it. Thank you. Thanks.